They came just after sunrise. No warning, no letter taped to the door, no polite knock pretending to be courtesy, just chainsaws. The sound hit first sharp, mechanical, violent. It didn't belong in the quiet that usually settled over my back acreage in the mornings. Out there, sound carried. It stretched across the fields, bounced off the tree line, and came back thinner but sharper. You could hear a truck half a mile away if the wind was right, so when the first tree cracked, I felt it before I was fully awake. By the time I stepped outside, pulling on my jacket, boots half-laced, there were already men on my land. 4 of them, and one woman standing back, watching. The first oak went down as I crossed the fence line. 60 years old, gone in under a minute. There's a specific sound a mature tree makes when it falls. It isn't just wood breaking. It's deeper than that. A long, splintering release that builds into a heavy collapse. Like something that took decades to grow just gave up all at once. The trunk hit the ground hard enough to travel through the soil and into my boots. Nobody stopped. Nobody even looked at me. Another saw fired up. That's when I saw her, standing about 20 feet inside my boundary line, right where the ground starts to slope toward the lake, pressed blazer, hands loosely folded, watching everything with the calm focus of someone reviewing a job already approved. Renata Holloway. Even if I hadn't known her name, I would have recognized the type. Controlled, composed, already convinced she was right. I walked straight toward her, didn't rush, didn't shout, just closed the distance and stopped a few feet away. "You're on my property," I said. She turned her head slightly, meeting my eyes without any hesitation. "We're clearing an obstruction," she replied. Her voice was flat, professional, the kind of tone that doesn't invite conversation. Behind her, another tree started to lean. "You've got about 10 seconds to shut this down," I said. She studied me for a moment. Not confused, not concerned, just measuring. "We have legal authorization," she said. "If you have an issue, you can take it up with our attorney." That was the moment everything shifted. Not the chainsaws, not the trees, that sentence. Because people who say things like that don't think they're taking a risk. They think the outcome is already decided. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "State your name," I said. She looked directly at the camera without hesitation. "Renata Holloway, president of the Pinerous Pines Homeowners Association. And you're authorizing this work?" "Yes. On land you don't own?" She didn't answer that. Another tree hit the ground behind us. 5 now. 5 trees that had been standing longer than most of the homes in her subdivision had even existed. The crew didn't slow down. That told me everything. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a boundary mistake. This had been planned. I stepped back and called the sheriff's department, gave them the address, kept my voice steady. Then I just stood there and watched. Not because I couldn't do anything, but because I understood something she didn't. You don't interrupt people when they're making a mistake like this. You let them finish. By the time the deputy arrived, the damage was already done. 5 stumps. Fresh, bright cuts, still wet with sap. The smell of raw wood mixing with fuel exhaust in the cold morning air. The crew had shut the saws off by then. Standing around like they were waiting for direction. Renata didn't move. She stood exactly where she had been the entire time, like the ground under her feet belonged to her. I showed the deputy the property line on my phone, pulled up the map, walked him to the boundary markers. "This line," I said. "They're inside it." He took his time looking at everything. Then he turned to her. "Ma'am, I'm going to need all work to stop until this gets sorted." She gave a small nod. No argument, no pushback. But her expression didn't change. Not worried, not defensive, just irritated. Like this was a delay, a temporary inconvenience. The crew started packing up. Saws back into cases. Fuel cans loaded. Equipment dragged toward the truck without a word. No one apologized. No one explained anything. They moved like this was just another job that had run into a scheduling issue. Renata was the last one to leave. She turned once before getting into her car, looked at the trees, then at me. A short, controlled glance, like she was noting something down in her head. Then she got in and shut the door. The engine started. Gravel crunched under her tires as she pulled away. And then it was quiet again. Too quiet. I stood there longer than I needed to. Long enough for the cold to settle into my hands. Long enough for the smell of fresh cut wood to stop feeling sharp and start feeling wrong. Those trees weren't decoration. They weren't just something that looked nice along a boundary line. They were part of how that land worked. They held soil in place, managed water flow, Stabilize the slope that ran down toward the lake. You don't remove something like that without consequences. And that's when the thought settled in. This wasn't about the trees. They were just in the way. I walked the boundary line again, slower this time, looking at details I'd usually ignore. That's when I saw it. The ground on their side wasn't just disturbed. It had been reshaped, subtle enough that most people wouldn't notice, but obvious if you knew what natural drainage was supposed to look like. The slope had changed, angled differently, pushing water toward my land. I crouched near the fence and brushed away a thin layer of loose soil. There it was, a pipe, partially buried, pointed straight across the boundary. I stared at it for a long moment, then stood up slowly. Because now it made sense. The letters, the complaints, the claims about drainage issues. They weren't reacting to a problem. They were building one. And those trees? They were the last thing stopping it from working. I went back to the house and pulled out the file I'd kept from the first letter they sent. Most people wouldn't have kept it, would have skimmed it once and tossed it aside. I didn't, because I've spent too many years working with land to trust paperwork that doesn't match what the ground is telling me. The first letter had been polite, almost friendly, mentioned vegetation concerns, suggested I clear the area to improve drainage efficiency. The second one had a different tone, more formal, more aggressive, talked about liability, potential flooding, legal responsibility. That was the shift. That's when they decided I was the problem. And now I knew why. I drove back out to the rear acreage later that afternoon, walked all the way down to the lake. It sat where it always had. Still, quiet, the surface smooth enough to reflect the sky and the tree line around it. At first glance, nothing looked different. But when you've spent years around the same piece of land, you notice things. The water line, the color near the inlet, the way the vegetation grows along the edges. It was subtle, but it was there. Change. Slow. Gradual. The kind that doesn't happen overnight. The kind that builds over time. And standing there, looking at that water, one thought kept repeating in the back of my mind. This didn't start this morning. It started a long time ago. And I had just walked into the middle of it. I didn't go back to the house right away. I stood there at the edge of the lake longer than I needed to, watching the surface like it might tell me something if I stayed still long enough. It always looked calm from a distance. That was the thing about water. It hides movement better than anything else. What you see on top almost never matches what's happening underneath. I crouched near the inlet where the spring fed into the lake. That's where the change was easiest to spot. The water there used to run clear enough that you could see the rock bed beneath it. Not perfectly, but enough to track movement, fish, debris, the way sediment settled after a storm. Now it was different. Cloudier, not dramatically, just enough that you had to look twice. And the vegetation along the edge, thicker than it should have been. That kind of growth doesn't happen without a reason. Too many nutrients, too much runoff, too much coming from somewhere it shouldn't. I reached into the water, let it run through my fingers, then stood up and looked back toward the tree line. Or what was left of it. 5 stumps. Clean cuts, deliberate, not rushed. They hadn't shown up that morning figuring things out as they went. They came knowing exactly where to cut, exactly what needed to go. I walked back up the slope slowly, following the natural path water would take during a heavy rain. Except now, it wasn't natural anymore. The grade had been altered just enough to change direction. Not dramatically. Not something you'd notice unless you knew what to look for. But enough. Enough to shift flow. Enough to redirect accumulation. Enough to make my property the lowest point in the system. And that pipe I found, it wasn't random. It was placed with purpose. Angle calculated. Position intentional. Someone had planned this. I went back inside and grabbed a notepad. Then I drove into town. There's a man named Paul Drummond who's been surveying land in this county longer than I've been running equipment. If you want to understand what land is doing, Gan, more importantly, what someone's done to it, you call him. He met me out there the next morning. Didn't say much at first. Just walked the boundary. Slow, methodical, stopping every few steps to look, measure, adjust his line of sight. He didn't need me to explain anything. Men like him read land the way other people read books. After about 20 minutes, he crouched near the pipe, cleared a little more dirt away with his boot. Then he stood up and looked at me. This wasn't here long, he said. How long? I asked. He glanced back at the soil. Couple months, maybe less. That lined up. The second letter, the escalation. The shift in tone. I pointed toward the slope on the HOA side. What about that? He didn't even have to walk over. Regraded, he said. And not by accident. He stepped back, looking across both properties together. They redirected flow, he added. Changed the path. Toward me. Yeah. He paused for a second, then added something that settled heavier than everything else he'd said. They created pressure on their side and gave it somewhere to go. I nodded slowly, because that's exactly what it felt like. Pressure. Building somewhere else. Released here. We walked the line again. He marked points. Took measurements. Logged coordinates. By the time he finished, I had more than a suspicion. I had documentation. But documentation only matters if you know what it connects to. So that afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went into my father's study. The room still smelled the same. Faint tobacco. Old paper. A trace of motor oil that never quite left no matter how long the windows stayed open. There was a lockbox in the lower cabinet. Same one it had always been. I pulled it out, set it on the desk, and opened it. Inside were the documents that mattered. Deeds, surveys, old agreements. Things that most people keep but never really read. I found the original deed from 1961. Paper slightly yellowed at the edges. Ink still sharp enough to read clearly. My grandfather's name printed at the top. I sat down and started reading, not skimming, not jumping to the parts I thought would matter. Every word, every line. Because I've learned something over the years, the parts people skip are usually the parts that matter most. The description of the land came first. Measurements. Boundaries. Reference points tied to landmarks that didn't even exist anymore. Then the standard clauses. Ownership. Transfer. Rights. Until I got near the bottom. That's where it changed. The wording shifted. More specific. More deliberate. It mentioned the lake. Not just as part of the property, but as something separate, defined, protected. I read the paragraph again. Slower this time. Then a third time. Because it wasn't just describing access. It was describing ownership. Not just of the land around the water, but the water itself, the source, the flow, the rights connected to everything feeding into it. I leaned back in the chair and stared at the page, because suddenly, everything outside made sense in a different way. The grading, the pipe, the trees being removed. This wasn't just about redirecting water. It was about taking control of where that water ended up. And if that water fed into something valuable, something legally protected, then redirecting it wasn't just a shortcut. It was a violation. I picked up the phone and called my cousin Darla. She's a property attorney. Spent years dealing with land disputes, easements, boundary issues. The kind of cases most people avoid until they don't have a choice. I didn't explain everything. I just told her I needed her to look at something. She came out the next day, Saturday at the same desk, read the same document, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she looked up at me. "Have you ever actually read this before?" she asked. "Not like this," I said. She nodded once, then tapped the paragraph with her finger. "This," she said, "changes everything." I didn't say anything, just waited. Because I could tell by the way she was looking at it, this wasn't small. "This isn't standard," she continued. "Most people have access rights to water, usage rights, not ownership." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your grandfather didn't just buy land," she said. "He secured control over the water system tied to it." I felt that settle in. Slow. Heavy. "What does that mean for what they're doing?" I asked. She didn't hesitate. "It means if they're redirecting water into your property or interfering with its natural flow," she tapped the page again. "They're not just crossing a boundary." She looked at me directly. "They're interfering with something you legally own." The room went quiet after that, because up until that moment, this had felt like a dispute, a problem, something that needed to be handled. But now, it was something else, something bigger. I thought back to Renata standing there that morning, calm, certain, telling me they had every right to be there. And for the first time since this started, I understood something clearly. She hadn't checked this, not properly. She built a plan, set things in motion, pushed it forward piece by piece, but she missed one thing. The one thing that mattered most. And now, everything she'd done was sitting on top of it. I closed the deed slowly and set it back on the desk. Then I looked at Darla. "So what happens next?" I asked. She gave a small, almost amused smile. "The part where they realize what they just walked into," she said. And something in the way she said it told me this wasn't going to stay small for long. Darla didn't rush. That was the first thing I noticed. Most people, when they hear something like that, something that shifts the entire balance of a situation, start moving fast, making calls, crafting responses, escalating. Darla didn't. She sat there at the desk reading the deed again. Then she asked for every letter the HOA had sent. I handed her the folder. She went through each one slowly, page by page, like she was looking for something specific hiding between the lines. When she finished, she stacked them neatly and tapped the edge against the desk. "They're building a narrative," she said. "What kind?" I asked. "One where you're the problem," she replied. "Obstruction, negligence, liability. It's all structured to make their actions look justified after the fact." I leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "And the easement they mentioned?" She shook her head slightly. "I want to see it," she said. So the next morning, she pulled the county records, everything filed under the subdivision. Amendments, covenants, easements. It didn't take her long to find it. A 2019 amendment to the HOA's governing documents. Broad language, vague boundary descriptions. The kind of wording that looks official until you actually analyze it. She printed it out and brought it back to the house. We sat at the kitchen table this time. Coffee between us, papers spread out. She pointed to a section halfway down the page. "This is what they're relying on," she said. I read it. Twice. It sounded legitimate, carefully written, full of terms designed to feel authoritative. "So what's the catch?" I asked. She leaned back slightly. "It doesn't apply to you." I looked up. "Why not?" "Because they never had the authority to apply it to you," she said. "This governs their members, their properties, not adjacent landowners who were never notified, never agreed, and never signed anything." She tapped the paper again. "They created internal rules and are pretending those rules extend beyond their boundary. And they think that holds up?" I asked. She gave a small shrug. "It holds up if no one challenges it." That made sense, because most people wouldn't. Most people would see legal language, see a law firm attached to it, and assume it was already settled. But this wasn't settled, not even close. "There's more," she said. She slid another document across the table, a survey overlay she'd requested using updated county mapping. It showed the HOA boundary, then my property. And right there, clear as day, the area they were claiming under that amendment extended past their line, into mine, not a little. Far enough that there was no ambiguity. They didn't just overreach, I said slowly. They crossed it completely. "Exactly," she replied. I exhaled, long and steady, because now the picture was clearer than it had been at any point since this started. They had built a legal framework, filed documents, created justification, but none of it actually connected to my land in a way that held up, which meant the chainsaws weren't backed by law. They were backed by assumption. And that's a dangerous thing to rely on when you're standing on someone else's property. "What about the water?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached for her phone and pulled up something I hadn't seen before. A section of state code. "This is where it gets worse for them," she said. She turned the screen toward me. "Altering natural drainage in a way that damages downstream property." She let the sentence hang for a second, especially when it affects a protected water source. I didn't need her to finish it. I already understood. "They're exposed," I said. "Very," she replied, "and they don't know it yet." She gave me a look that told me she was already thinking 3 steps ahead. "That depends," she said. "We're about to tell them." That same afternoon, she drafted a response. Not aggressive, not emotional, just precise. It outlined everything: the invalid easement, the lack of jurisdiction, the documented alteration of land, the pipe, the drainage redirection, and the water rights clause from the deed. Every point backed by evidence. Every statement written in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. She printed it, signed it, and sent it certified to both the HOA and their law firm. Then we waited. 10 days passed. Quiet. No activity along the boundary. No follow-up letters. No attempts to contact me directly. If I didn't know better, I would have thought they backed off. But Darla didn't think that. "They're not done," she said. "How do you know?" I asked. "Because people who build something this layered don't walk away after one pushback," she replied. She was right. On the 11th day, a package arrived, certified, from their attorney. Inside was a formal demand letter and a copy of the same easement amendment, only this time they weren't suggesting it. They were asserting it, demanding compliance, demanding acknowledgement, and listing costs they expected me to cover. I read it once, then handed it to Darla. She didn't look surprised. If they admit uncertainty, the whole thing collapses, she said. So they doubled down. I nodded slowly, because that felt accurate. This wasn't someone reconsidering their position. This was someone committing to it, fully, no matter what it cost. I walked outside after she left that evening, back down toward the tree line. The stumps were already drying at the edges, color fading slightly, but still fresh enough to remind me what had happened. I looked past them, toward the slope, toward the invisible path water would take the next time it rained. Everything connected now, the letters, the grading, the pipe, the trees. It wasn't random, it was a system, built piece by piece. And I had just stepped into the part of it they didn't expect anyone to question. The wind moved through the remaining trees, low and steady. And standing there, one thought kept settling deeper the longer I stayed still. They weren't going to stop, not because they were right, but because they believed they were too far in to turn back. And people like that, they don't retreat, they escalate, which meant whatever came next was going to be bigger than 5 trees. A lot bigger. The chainsaws came back 2 weeks later. Earlier this time. Colder too. Frost still sitting on the grass, turning everything silver under the first light. The kind of morning where sound feels sharper, like it cuts through the air instead of moving with it. I heard them before I saw anything. Same engines, same rhythm, no hesitation. I didn't rush this time. I already knew what I was walking into. By the time I reached the boundary, they were inside it again. Not testing the line. Not checking anything. Just continuing. Like the first time had never been interrupted. One of the stumps from before had already been ground down. Another tree was halfway cut, and Renata stood exactly where she had the first time. Same distance in, same posture. Same expression, that calm, controlled certainty like nothing that had happened in the past 2 weeks mattered. I stopped a few feet away from her, didn't raise my voice, didn't even take my phone out yet. You were told to stop, I said. She glanced at me briefly. Then back at the crew. We are operating within our rights, she replied. Flat, rehearsed. You were told by the sheriff's department to stop, I said. This is a civil matter, she said. We've been advised accordingly. That told me everything I needed to know. They had gotten legal advice. Or at least, enough of it to convince themselves they were safe. That made this worse. Not better. Because now this wasn't just overconfidence. It was calculated. I stepped back and started recording again. Same as before. Clear. Direct. You are currently on private property without permission, I said. You've been formally notified, you've been warned by law enforcement, and you are continuing work anyway. She didn't respond, didn't even look at the camera this time. That was different. The first time she wanted it on record. This time she didn't need it. Because in her mind, the outcome was already locked in. Another tree cracked behind us. The crew didn't stop, not even when the trunk started to fall. I called the sheriff again. Same tone, same information. And then I waited, because now I understood something clearly. They weren't just trying to get away with it. They were trying to finish it. Whatever they needed from this land, it required the trees gone. All of them. The deputy arrived faster this time. Different one. Older. Didn't say much when he got out of the vehicle. Just looked. At the trees. At the equipment. At the line where my markers sat clearly in place. Then at me. Same. Situation? He asked. Same people, I said. He walked over to Renata. Spoke to her quietly at first. I couldn't hear everything. But I saw her posture shift slightly. Not much, just enough to notice. He gestured toward the trees. Then toward the boundary. Then back toward the equipment. The crew slowed. Then stopped. Not immediately. Not cleanly. But enough. Engines idling down one by one. The deputy turned back toward me. This needs to stop until it's resolved, he said. I nodded. I've said that, I replied. He gave a small, tired look, like he'd already seen how this was going to go. Renata stepped forward then. This is being handled legally, she said. We have documentation supporting our position. He didn't argue, didn't engage, just shook his head slightly. Not out here, he said. Not like this. That was it. No arrests. No escalation. Just another stop. Temporary. The crew started packing up again. Less slowly this time. More tension. Less certainty. They knew something had shifted, even if they didn't understand what. Renata didn't move right away. She stood there for a moment longer than necessary. Then she turned toward me. This isn't over, she said. Not angry, not loud, just direct. I met her gaze. I know, I said. She held that eye contact for a second longer, then walked back to her vehicle. This time, she didn't look at the trees before leaving, didn't take anything in, just got in, shut the door, and drove off, faster than before. The silence that followed felt different, heavier. Not shock this time, not confusion, just clarity. I walked the line again after they left. Another 2 trees gone. More damage. More space open where there shouldn't have been any. And the ground it was already starting to change. Without the roots holding it, the soil felt looser. Less stable. That slope was going to shift. It was just a matter of time. I crouched near the pipe again, looked at the angle, followed the direction with my eyes. Straight toward the lake, straight into the inlet. They weren't just trying to move water. They were trying to control where it ended up. And now with more of the tree line gone, there was less resistance, less filtration, less natural protection. I stood up slowly, because something else was settling in. They had been warned, formally, legally, directly, and they kept going. That changes things, a lot. Because there's a difference between making a mistake and continuing after you've been told it is one. I pulled out my phone and called Darla. They came back, I said. I heard the pause on the other end. How bad? She asked. Worse, I replied. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Another pause, shorter this time. Good, she said. I frowned slightly. Good? I repeated. Yes, she said. Because now it's not just a dispute. I didn't say anything. I already understood where she was going. They've been warned, she continued. They've been stopped by law enforcement, and they continued anyway. She let that sit for a second. That changes the level of liability. I looked out over the damaged line again, at the gaps where trees used to stand, at the exposed ground, at the path that water would now take without resistance. They're not going to stop, I said. No, she replied calmly. They're not. So what do we do? Her answer came without hesitation. We stop them. There was something in her voice that hadn't been there before. Not frustration, not concerned. Focus, clear, sharp, controlled. The next step isn't a letter, she said. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see it. Then what is it? I asked. There was a brief silence, just long enough to feel intentional. Now, she said, we make it official. I ended the call and stood there for another minute, just listening. No engines, no voices, just wind moving through what was left of the trees. And for the first time since this started, I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't trying to figure out what they were doing or why. I already knew. Now it was about what came next, and something told me they weren't ready for that part. The paperwork started moving the following Monday. Not slowly, not cautiously, fast. Darla filed everything at once. Not one claim, not two, multiple. Layered in a way that made it impossible to separate one issue from the other. Trespass, property damage, unauthorized timber removal. And then the one that mattered most, interference with a protected water source. Each one stood on its own. Together, they built something heavier. Something that didn't just question what the HOA had done. It challenged the entire structure behind it. I didn't sit in the office while she worked. I went back to the land. Because that's where all of this started. And that's where the truth always shows itself if you know how to look. I walked the boundary again, slower than before, not just observing, recording. Photos from every angle. Close-ups of the cuts, the stumps, the exposed roots, the soil where the grade had been altered, the pipe, everything. If this turned into a fight, and I knew it would, every inch of that ground needed to speak for itself. By midweek, something changed. Not on my side, on theirs. Activity, not loud, not obvious, but different. A truck parked near the far end of their fence line. 2 men walking the edge, stopping every few feet, looking down, measuring something. They didn't cross over this time, didn't touch anything, but they were there longer than they needed to be, watching, assessing, trying to figure out what they'd stepped into. I didn't approach them, didn't need to, because now the positions had shifted. Before, they acted. Now they were reacting. That's a different kind of pressure. And people don't handle it the same way. 2 days later, Darla called. They responded, she said. I leaned back in the chair. How bad? I asked. There was a small pause. Predictable, she said. They're denying everything. Of course they were. That includes the pipe? I asked. Yes, the grading. She let out a short breath. There. claiming it was authorized under the easement. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was expected. They're still holding on to that? I said. They have to, she replied. If that falls apart, everything falls apart. I nodded slowly, because that part was true. The easement wasn't just part of their argument. It was the foundation of it. Without it, they had nothing. What's next? I asked. They think this stays between attorneys, she said. And it doesn't? I replied. No, she said. It doesn't. That afternoon, something else happened. Something neither of us expected. A state vehicle pulled up near the boundary, marked, official. 2 people stepped out, clipped movements. No wasted motion. They weren't there to talk. They were there to inspect. I walked out to meet them, introduced myself. They already knew who I was. One of them held a clipboard. The other had a case with testing equipment. We're here regarding a complaint, the first one said. I nodded. I figured you might be. They didn't ask many questions at first. They walked, observed, stopped at the pipe. One of them crouched down, clearing dirt carefully around the opening. The other took photos. Then they moved toward the inlet, where the water is fed into the lake. That's where they stayed the longest. Testing, collecting samples, checking levels, not rushing, not speculating, just documenting. I stood back and watched, because this part didn't need my input. The land was already saying enough. After about 40 minutes, they walked back toward me. The one with the clipboard looked up. How long have you noticed changes in the water? She asked. I thought about it. Gradual, I said. Last few years, worse recently. She nodded like that confirmed something. Any known sources upstream? She asked. I didn't hesitate. The subdivision, I said. And whatever they've installed along that boundary. She wrote that down, then glanced back toward the pipe. We'll be following up on this, she said. Her tone wasn't casual. It wasn't a possibility. It was a direction. Do you need anything from me? I asked. Documentation, she said. Anything you've recorded, photos, timeline. You'll have it, I replied. They packed up without another word, got back in the vehicle, and left. No conclusions, no explanations. But I didn't need them, as I had seen enough to understand what just happened. This wasn't contained anymore. This wasn't just a legal argument between me and an HOA. Now it had crossed into something bigger, something they couldn't control. That evening, I called Darla. They're here, I said. Who? She asked. State, I replied. There was a pause, then a quiet, satisfied breath on the other end. Good, she said. You sound like you were expecting that, I replied. I was hoping for it, she said. There's a difference. I leaned against the counter. They tested the water, I added. Another pause, longer this time. That's even better, she said. Why? Because if what we think is happening is actually happening, she said slowly, this just stopped being a private dispute. I didn't respond right away. I didn't need to. I could already feel it shifting. The scale of it, the direction. Everything about this was getting bigger and faster. They're going to push back, I said. Of course they are, she replied. They already are. I looked out the window toward the back acreage, toward the line where the trees used to stand. They still think they're in control, I said. For now, she replied. That word sat there for a second. For now. Temporary, unstable. I thought about Renata, the way she stood there both times. Calm, certain, like she was operating inside a system that guaranteed her outcome. But systems only work when the assumptions behind them hold. And hers, they were starting to crack, one by one. Keep documenting everything, Darla said. I will, I replied. And don't engage with them directly anymore. I nodded. That part's easy, I said. Because at this point, there wasn't anything left to say. They had made their move, repeated it, pushed it further after being warned. And now everything that followed wasn't going to be decided on that boundary line. It was going to be decided somewhere else, somewhere they didn't control. I ended the call and stepped outside. The air was colder now, the light fading faster, and the land felt different. Not damaged, not broken, just waiting for something to settle, for something to come back down after being pushed too far. I looked out toward the lake one more time. Surface still, quiet, like nothing had changed, but I knew better. Because once something like this starts, it doesn't stop halfway. It runs its course. And whatever they had set in motion was already moving faster than they realized. After the state visit, everything went quiet. Too quiet. No trucks along the fence line. No workers measuring or walking the boundary. No letters taped to my door. No follow-ups from their attorney. If you didn't know what had already happened, you'd think the problem had just disappeared. But that kind of silence isn't relief. It's pressure. The kind that builds when people realize they've crossed a line they can't uncross. Darla didn't treat it like a pause. She treated it like an opportunity. We build now, she said, while they're trying to figure out how to respond. And that's exactly what we did. She brought in another attorney, not for property disputes, for water rights. A man who had spent decades dealing with cases that most people never even knew existed. He came out on a cold morning, walked the land the same way Paul had, but slower, more deliberate. When he reached the lake, he didn't say anything at first, just stood there, looking at it. Then he asked me one question. Has the water level changed? Not dramatically, I said. But the quality has. He nodded once. Like that was enough. We walked back toward the inlet, toward the pipe, toward the altered slope. He crouched down, studied the angle, the placement, the direction. Then he stood up and looked across both properties at once. They didn't just redirect water, he said. They interfered with a system. I didn't respond. I just listened. Natural flow isn't random, he continued. It follows patterns that develop over time. When you interrupt that, especially upstream, he let the sentence hang. You change everything downstream. I looked past him toward the lake, because I could see it now. Not just the damage, the intent. They were trying to use it, I said. He glanced at me. Yes, he replied. And they didn't have the right to. That was the difference. That was what separated this from a normal dispute. They weren't just dealing with land. They were dealing with something attached to it, something protected, something defined long before they ever showed up. When he finished his inspection, he didn't give a long explanation, didn't speculate, just gave Darla what she needed. And what she needed was confirmation. That same week, the report came back from the state, not official yet, not finalized, but enough to understand what they had found. Elevated nutrient levels, consistent with runoff, long-term exposure. Not a one-time event, not accidental, sustained, documented. I read through it twice, then a third time, because every line pointed in the same direction. This didn't start recently. It had been happening for years. Quietly, gradually, building up until it couldn't be ignored anymore. I called Darla that afternoon. They've been doing this longer than we thought, I said. I know, she replied. You've seen it? Yes. There was no surprise in her voice, just confirmation. What does that mean for them? I asked. There was a pause, not hesitation, calculation. It means this isn't just about what they did last month, she said. It's about what they've been doing for years. I leaned back in, the chair, because that changes things, a lot. Short-term mistakes can be explained, managed, sometimes even dismissed. Long-term behavior? That's harder to walk away from, especially when it's documented, especially when it's been denied. They're exposed on more than one level now, she continued. Legal, environmental, financial. I nodded slowly, even though she couldn't see it, and they still think this is a boundary issue. I said, not for long, she replied. That shift started showing up sooner than I expected. 3 days later, I got a call from someone inside the subdivision. Didn't give their name at first, didn't need to. Their voice carried something familiar, concern. What exactly is going on, they asked. I didn't answer immediately, not because I didn't know. Because I wanted to understand why they were asking. What have you been told? I said. A pause. Then that everything is under control. I almost smiled at that. Of course that's what they were told. That's not accurate, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. What's the exposure? They asked quietly. There it was, that word. Exposure. That meant something had shifted inside their community. People were asking questions. Not just about what happened, but about what it could cost. I kept my answer simple. More than they've told you, I said. Silence. Then are we talking lawsuits? Yes. State involvement? Yes. Another pause. Then the voice dropped slightly. They didn't mention that. Of course they didn't. Because once you say that out loud, you lose control of the narrative. Then you should start asking why, I said. The call ended not long after that. No arguments. No pushback. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that spreads. Because once one person starts asking questions, others follow. That same week, something else happened. Their attorney reached out again. Different tone this time. Less aggressive. More careful, requesting discussion. Clarification. Possibility of. Resolution. Darla read through it once, then set it down. They're trying to slow this down, she said. Can they? I asked. No, she replied. Not anymore. Because at this point, it wasn't just in their hands. It wasn't even just in ours. Too many things were already moving. Too many people involved. Too much documentation in place. You can't slow something like that once it reaches a certain point. You can only react to it. And reacting means you're no longer in control. I walked the property again that evening. Same path, same line, but it felt different now. Not uncertain, not tense. Clear, like everything had settled into place. The stumps were still there, the exposed ground, the altered slope, but now they weren't just damage, they were evidence. Every part of it, every inch. Connected, telling the same story. I stopped near the pipe one more time, looked at it, then followed its direction with my eyes, straight toward the lake, straight into something they never should have touched. And standing there, one thought settled in completely. They didn't just make a mistake, they built one, piece by piece, decision by decision. And now it was too big to fix quietly, too big to explain away, too big to ignore. I turned back toward the house slowly, because whatever came next wasn't going to happen out here anymore. It was going to happen where everything gets decided, on record, in front of people who don't care about assumptions, only facts. And for the first time since this started, I knew exactly how that was going to go. Not because I was guessing, because everything leading up to it had already made the outcome clear. The meeting was scheduled for a Saturday evening, same place they always held it, same format, same assumption that it would go the way it always had. That assumption didn't hold for long. Word had already spread through the neighborhood by the time people started arriving. Not details, not specifics, just enough to make people show up more than usual. A lot more. By the time it started, every chair was filled, and people were standing along the walls. That doesn't happen unless something is wrong. Renata stood at the front like she always did. Organized. Composed. A folder in front of her. Her attorney seated off to the side. Everything looked normal. Until it didn't. The first part of the meeting went the way these things usually go. Routine items, updates, numbers that most people don't really pay attention to. But the room felt different, quieter, tighter. People weren't distracted. They were waiting, watching. Then she moved to the agenda item. Boundary maintenance update. That's what she called it. Simple, neutral, controlled. She started speaking. Same tone she'd used from the beginning. Measured, confident, framing everything as a misunderstanding. A minor issue. Something being handled. That lasted about 3 minutes. Then someone stood up. Didn't wait to be called. Didn't hesitate. What's the total liability, he asked. The room shifted. You could feel it. Renata paused, just for a second, then recovered. That's still being evaluated, she said. That answer didn't land, because now people knew there was something to evaluate. Another voice, from the other side of the room. Is there a lawsuit? She tried to redirect, tried to move forward, but it was too late. Once questions like that start, they don't stop. Yes, I said. I hadn't planned to speak first, but the moment was there. And if you wait too long in a room like that, you lose it. Every head turned. Some recognized me. Most didn't. That's not accurate, her attorney started. It is, Darla said, standing up beside me. Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. It carried. Clear. And backed by something stronger than confidence. Facts. She didn't rush. She didn't argue. She explained. The claims, the filings, the documentation, the inspections, piece by piece, not emotionally, not aggressively, just clearly. Every sentence added something. Every point connected to the next, until the full picture was sitting in the room where no one could ignore it anymore. Trees cut without authorization, land altered, water redirected, state involvement, long-term discharge, denied permits, and the part that hit hardest, the financial exposure tied to all of it. You could feel the shift. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was worse. It was understanding. Because once people understood, they started doing the math. Not just what happened, but what it could cost them, personally. Another homeowner stood up, then another. Questions started coming faster now. Not general ones, specific ones. Was this approved? Who signed off on it? Why weren't we told? That last one stayed in the air longer than the others, because no one had a good answer for it. Renata tried to respond, tried to pull control back. But the structure she relied on, the one that worked when people stayed quiet, was gone. And once that breaks, you can't rebuild it in the same room. One of the older residents stood up near the front, voice steady. Clear. I was at that meeting, he said. Silence. Immediate. Complete. He looked around the room before continuing. It wasn't presented like this, he added. There it was. Not accusation. Not emotion. Just truth. And that's what shifted everything. Because it confirmed what people were already starting to suspect. They hadn't been told the full story. Not even close. Renata's attorney stepped in then, trying to contain it, shift it back into something controlled. But it didn't work. Because this wasn't a legal room anymore. It was a room full of people realizing something had been done in their name without their understanding, without their consent, possibly at their expense. That's not something you talk your way out of. The pressure built fast after that, not shouting, not chaos, just question after question, each one narrowing the space she had left to stand in, until there wasn't much left at all. She stood there for a moment, hands resting on the podium, looking out at a room that wasn't on her side anymore. Then she did something I don't think anyone expected. She stopped, completely, took a breath, and said, I'm stepping down. No explanation, no defense, just that. Then she closed the folder, picked it up, and walked out. No one followed her. No one tried to stop her, because by that point it was already over. The rest of the board didn't last much longer. Once the structure breaks at the top, everything under it starts to shift. Positions changed. People stepped aside. New ones stepped in. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Damage control, that's what it became. Quiet, controlled, necessary. The settlement didn't happen immediately. These things don't, but it moved faster than most, because the alternative was worse, much worse. They agreed to terms that covered everything, the damage, the restoration, the legal costs, and the part that mattered most to me, full removal of everything they had installed along that boundary. Every pipe, every alteration. Everything returned to the way it should have been. The state penalties came separately, handled on their side. Not mine, but they hit. Hard enough to matter. Hard enough to make sure it didn't happen again. The work to fix the land took time, months, careful work. Not just undoing what had been done, but stabilizing what was left. Rebuilding the slope, reinforcing the soil, restoring the natural path the water was supposed to follow. The lake took longer. Water doesn't recover on command. It takes time, balance, patience. But it started improving. Slowly, clarity coming back, vegetation settling into something normal again, the way it should have been. I went down there one evening not long after everything was finished. Saturday near the edge. Same spot I'd stood the day this started. The surface was still, clearer than it had been in years. And for the first time in a long time, nothing felt off. No tension, no imbalance, just quiet. The way it was supposed to be. I thought about everything that had happened. The letters, the trees, the meetings, the assumptions, and how close it had come to going a completely different way. Because if I hadn't looked closer, if I hadn't read what was already there, they might have gotten exactly what they wanted. That's the part most people miss. These situations don't turn on big moments. They turn on small ones. Decisions, details, things people ignore because they don't seem important at the time. Until they are. I stood up after a while, looked out across the water one more time, then turned back toward the house, because at the end of all of it, that's what this was really about. Not the fight, not the money, not even the outcome, just making sure that what was mine stayed that way.